The body on the table had been dead for 6 hours. The physician standing over it had already watched 3 of his colleagues die the same way. Swollen, blackened, screaming. He knew what was inside. He had seen the buboes, the hemorrhages, the necrotic flesh. He knew that opening this corpse might kill him too. He picked up the blade anyway. This is the story of the men and women who tried to understand the Black Death, not from a safe distance, but from inside the catastrophe itself. Who performed autopsies on plague victims at a time when no one understood what plague was, where it came from, or how it spread? Who wrote down what they found and sent their notes to other physicians across a dying continent, knowing those notes might be the only thing they left behind? Welcome to the Medical Grimoire. I'm your narrator, and tonight we open the dead. To understand what the Black Death autopsies meant, you first have to understand the world they happened in. Not just the scale of the catastrophe, though that scale is almost impossible to fully absorb, but the medical world of 14th century Europe and what physicians believed about the human body and disease before the plague arrived. In 1346, European medicine was built almost entirely on the theories of the ancient Greek physician Galen, who had died nearly 12 centuries earlier. Galen's system held that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was an imbalance. Treatment meant restoring equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustment, and the application of various herbal preparations. This system had its own internal logic. It had been refined over generations. Physicians trained in it were not fools. Many were among the most educated people in Europe. But it had a fundamental problem. It was wrong. And the plague was about to make that wrongness catastrophically, undeniably visible. No event in recorded European history has killed a larger proportion of the population in a shorter time. Not the 2 world wars combined, not the Spanish flu, nothing. And into this catastrophe, armed with Galenic theory and iron courage, walked the physicians. The clinical picture of plague was unlike anything European medicine had encountered. Patients developed sudden, violent fever. Within hours or days, they began to show the disease's most distinctive sign, the bubo. Swollen lymph nodes, primarily in the groin, armpit, or neck, that could grow to the size of an egg or even an apple. Black, hemorrhagic, exquisitely painful. In some cases, they burst through the skin. Alongside the bubonic form, physicians encountered 2 even more lethal variants: septicemic plague, in which the bacteria flooded the bloodstream directly, causing massive internal hemorrhage, skin blackening, and death within hours, sometimes before any buboes appeared at all. And pneumonic plague, airborne, spreading through the breath, killing within 1 to 3 days, with a near-perfect mortality rate. The physicians observing all of this were seeing something that their entire theoretical framework could not explain. This was not a humoral imbalance. The speed of death was incompatible with the slow processes of humor dysregulation. The pattern of spread, entire households, entire streets, entire cities, suggested something transmissible in a way that Galenic medicine had no vocabulary for. Some of the most important early accounts came from the medical faculty of the University of Paris, which in 1348 produced a formal report on the plague at the request of the French king Philip VI. The report attributed the epidemic to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345. An astrological explanation that seems absurd to modern ears, but represented the cutting edge of learned European medicine at the time. But embedded in the same document were careful clinical observations, descriptions of symptoms, progression, and the results of post-mortem examinations that are medically recognizable today. The Parisian physicians may have had the wrong explanation, but they were looking closely, and what they saw in the bodies of plague victims was deeply disturbing. The internal findings described in contemporary accounts include lungs that were black, consolidated, filled with bloody fluid, lymph nodes grotesquely enlarged, necrotic at the core, livers and spleens massively swollen, blood that was dark, thick, sometimes clotted in the vessels, skin that had hemorrhaged from within, producing the subcutaneous bleeding, the dark blotches that gave the disease its eventual common name. These were not the findings of a humoral imbalance. They were the findings of a systemic bacterial infection causing massive inflammatory response, sepsis, tissue destruction, and organ failure. The physicians could not have known that, but they wrote down what they saw, and what they saw was accurate. The practice of human dissection in medieval Europe was complicated by both religious prohibition and practical circumstance. The Catholic Church did not universally ban autopsy. The historical record on this is more nuanced than is often presented, but it was rarely performed, poorly standardized, and conducted in conditions that were almost uniformly dangerous. Plague autopsies were performed in these already difficult conditions, with the additional knowledge that the body on the table was almost certainly still infectious. Medieval physicians did not understand germ theory that would not arrive for another 5 centuries, but many of them had observed that contact with plague victims and their bodies was associated with transmission of the disease. Some performed autopsies wearing what we might today recognize as rudimentary protective equipment: waxed cloth, vinegar-soaked rags held over the nose and mouth, gloves of thick leather. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough, but they did it anyway. One of the most important documented plague autopsies of the 14th century was performed in Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, in 1348. Pope Clement VI, who had been informed by his physicians that the plague was caused by corrupted air, or miasma, authorized post-mortem examinations of plague victims in an attempt to identify the source of the corruption. The examinations were conducted by the papal physician Guy de Chauliac, one of the most accomplished surgeons of the medieval period. De Chauliac's written accounts describe what he found with a precision and clinical detachment that is remarkable for the era. He documented the pulmonary findings, the blackened, fluid-filled lungs of pneumonic plague victims. He described the buboes in detail, noting their location, consistency, and the material released when they were incised. He observed the pattern of spread within the body, noting that the disease appeared to move through channels he could not fully identify. He also contracted the plague himself. He survived, one of the small minority who did, and wrote about the experience from the inside, describing his own symptoms, his own terror, and his own recovery with the same careful observation he had applied to the bodies of those who hadn't been so fortunate. His account is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of medicine. A physician sick with the most lethal disease in European history, continuing to observe and record while he believed he might be dying. What did medieval physicians conclude from what they found in plague autopsies? The answer is both impressive and heartbreaking. Impressive because of how carefully they reasoned from the evidence they had, and heartbreaking because their conclusions, though logical, pointed them toward responses that did little to stop the disease, and sometimes made things worse. The dominant theory that emerged from autopsy findings and clinical observation was the miasma theory, the idea that plague was caused by corrupted poisonous air arising from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, unburied bodies, or astronomical influences. The blackened lungs of pneumonic plague victims seemed to support this. Here was evidence that something had entered the body through the air and destroyed the organs of respiration first. This was wrong about the mechanism. Then plague is bacterial, not atmospheric, but it was not entirely wrong about the association. Conditions that produced miasma also tended to produce the environmental circumstances in which plague spread efficiently: crowding, poor sanitation, the presence of rats and fleas. Cities that responded to plague by cleaning their streets, removing unburied bodies, and dispersing crowded populations sometimes did reduce transmission, not because they had eliminated the miasma, but because they had reduced the conditions that allowed Yersinia pestis to spread. Other theories were less fortunate in their accidental accuracy. Some physicians concluded from autopsy findings that the plague arose from within the body itself, from a corruption of the blood or a spontaneous generation of poison in the organs. This led to aggressive bloodletting as a treatment, removing the corrupted blood before it could spread the poison further. In a disease that already caused massive hemorrhage and blood loss in its most severe forms, bloodletting was potentially lethal on top of lethal. A smaller number of medieval physicians, examining the pattern of spread and the autopsy findings together, began to articulate something closer to a contagion theory. The idea that plague passed directly from person to person or from contaminated objects. The Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, writing just before he died of plague in 1348, described what he called a seeds of disease model, in which something small and transmissible passed between individuals. He did not know what that something was, but the concept was present, expressed in the language available to him, 5 centuries before germ theory would give it a name. We should speak directly about what it cost to do this work. Medieval physicians died of plague at rates that appear to have been significantly higher than the general population. A grim testament to the fact that proximity to plague victims, including dead ones, increased exposure. Exact figures are impossible to reconstruct, but contemporary accounts suggest that in the most severely affected cities, the majority of practicing physicians died during the first wave of the epidemic. Gentile da Foligno, professor of medicine at the University of Perugia, one of the most respected physicians in Italy, died of plague in June 1348, weeks after completing his formal consultation on the disease. He had spent his final weeks examining patients, conducting autopsies, and writing. His consilia, his formal medical opinions, circulated widely after his death and influenced plague medicine for generations. Alfonso de Cordoba, a Spanish physician working in France, died of plague in 1348 after writing one of the earliest accounts of the epidemic in Western Europe. Johannes de Tornamira, physician to the Avignon papal court, died of plague while treating patients. Simon de Covino, who wrote a long poem about the epidemic that contains some of the sharpest contemporary medical observations, died of plague in 1348. These are only the names we know, the physicians prominent enough to have left written records. Behind them were hundreds of others: barber surgeons, apothecaries, hospital attendants, the men and women who prepared bodies for burial. They left no records. They simply died. There is something that deserves to be said plainly. These people were not ignorant. They were working at the absolute frontier of human knowledge about disease. Their tools were inadequate. Their theories were wrong. Their protective measures were insufficient. They knew all of this, at least partially, and they continued anyway because there were sick people who needed care and dead people who might yield answers, and someone had to do the work. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly what medicine has always been. We cannot tell the story of the Black Death autopsies without telling another story that ran alongside it. One of the worst consequences of medical ignorance combined with social terror. As plague swept through Europe and physicians struggled to explain it, a devastating false theory gained traction: that the epidemic had been caused deliberately by Jewish communities poisoning wells. There was no evidence for this. There had never been any evidence for this. Plague killed Jewish communities at the same catastrophic rates as Christian ones, in some cases higher, possibly because Jewish religious law mandated more frequent contact with the sick and the dead. But evidence was not what people wanted. They wanted an explanation. They wanted someone to blame. And in the social climate of 14th century Europe, already saturated with centuries of state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, Jewish communities became the target. Beginning in 1348 and continuing through 1351, pogroms swept across German-speaking lands, France, Spain, and beyond. Entire Jewish communities were massacred. In Strasbourg in February 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish residents were burned alive. This was before the plague had even arrived in the city. In Mainz and Cologne, in Frankfurt and Nuremberg, the pattern repeated. Pope Clement VI, the same pope who had authorized plague autopsies in Avignon, issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 explicitly stating that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague and ordering Christian authorities to protect them. The bulls were largely ignored. What is the connection to the autopsies? It is this: the physicians performing post-mortem examinations had access to evidence that directly contradicted the poisoning theory. They could see inside the bodies they opened the same pathological findings in Jewish and Christian corpses alike. The same blackened lungs, the same necrotic lymph nodes, the same hemorrhagic destruction. Some physicians said so. Some wrote explicitly that the disease was natural in origin, arising from causes within the body or the environment, not from human malice. Some, like Guy de Chauliac, were listened to, at least in the circles of learned medicine. Most were not. The massacres continued. This is one of the earliest documented cases in medical history of scientific evidence being available and being deliberately ignored in favor of a socially convenient falsehood. It would not be the last. The Black Death did not immediately revolutionize medicine. The old theories persisted for centuries. Bloodletting continued. Miasma theory continued. The humoral system continued. Change in medicine, as in most human institutions, is slower than catastrophe might suggest it should be. But the plague autopsies left a residue that mattered. The systematic observation of plague victims, the careful documentation of what was found inside the bodies of people who died of a specific disease, contributed to a gradual shift in European medicine toward empirical observation as a foundation for medical knowledge. Not theory first, then observation to confirm it. Observation first, then theory to explain it. This is not a small thing. It is in some ways the beginning of the scientific method as applied to medicine. The Black Death also transformed European institutions in ways that directly shaped modern public health. The quarantine system, isolating ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected areas for a set period before allowing them to land, was developed in Ragusa, present-day Dubrovnik, in 1377. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quarantina giorni, 40 days. These 40-day isolation periods were not based on a correct understanding of plague transmission, but they worked well enough to reduce spread. And they established the principle that collective action could limit epidemic disease. Hospitals, public health boards, and systems for registering and recording deaths were all dramatically expanded or created in response to the plague. The need to track who was dying, where, and in what numbers to understand the shape of an epidemic drove the development of what we would today recognize as epidemiology. And the autopsies themselves, the act of opening plague bodies to see what was inside, contributed something else. They demonstrated to those who performed them and those who read the accounts that disease had a physical reality that could be observed, described, and potentially understood. That the interior of the human body, even a diseased and dying one, was a source of knowledge, rather than simply a site of suffering. It took another 3 centuries for that knowledge to accumulate into something like modern pathology. But the physicians who stood over plague victims in 1348, blade in hand, not knowing if they would be dead within the week, were part of the beginning of that accumulation. One final thing worth knowing. The Black Death did not end in 1351. Plague returned to Europe in waves for the next 3 centuries. The second pandemic of bubonic plague lasted in various outbreaks until the early 18th century. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed roughly 100,000 people, perhaps a quarter of the city's population. Plague devastated Marseille in 1720, killing 50,000. Outbreaks continued in the Ottoman Empire into the 19th century, and Yersinia pestis has not disappeared. The third pandemic of plague, which began in China in the 1850s and spread globally via steamship routes, killed approximately 12 million people, primarily in India, between 1855 and 1960. It was during this third pandemic, in 1894, that the bacterium responsible for plague was finally identified, simultaneously and independently, by the French-Swiss physician Alexandre Yersin and the Japanese physician Kitasato Shibasaburo. plague exists today. Small numbers of cases are reported every year in parts of Africa, Asia, and the American Southwest, where the bacterium persists in wild rodent populations. It is now treatable with antibiotics, if diagnosed early. The mortality rate in treated cases is low, but in untreated cases, the mortality rate of septicemic plague remains close to 100%. The disease that killed a third of medieval Europe is still out there, waiting in the soil, carried by fleas on the backs of rodents. It has simply become one of the many things that modern medicine has, for now, learned to manage. The physicians of 1348 did not save Europe. They could not. They did not have the tools, the knowledge, or the time. But they stood over the dead and they looked. When everything in human instinct said to run, they wrote down what they saw and sent their words across a dying continent. Some of those words survived. We know what plague looks like inside a human body partly because of men like Guy de Chauliac and Gentile de Foligno, who opened bodies when no one told them to, and no one could protect them, who paid, in many cases with their lives, for the simple and extraordinary act of wanting to understand. That impulse, to cut, to look, to know, is the thread that runs from the medieval plague physicians to the modern hospital. It is not a comfortable thread. It is often a dark one, but it is there, and it holds. That's the story of the Black Death autopsies. The physicians who walked into the catastrophe with a blade in their hand and a notebook open, and who gave us the first clear look inside the deadliest disease Europe has ever faced. Next time on the medical Grimoire, we move forward in history to the age of the body snatchers, the underground trade in human corpses, and the medical schools that could not survive without them. If this episode reached you, share it with someone who appreciates history told honestly from the inside. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. I'll see you in the archive.